Okay, so welcome guys to this video, and we're just talking about a data perspective to a counter-terrorism strategy. And any decent business school holds that a data-based approach to decision making is always the proper way to go about it. So if you have a problem over here, you collect as much data about the problem, and this data is what informs your intervening variable, and you track through measurement whether the problem is being solved. So if we were to look at child mortality and assume that the probability stands at 1 in 10,000, we'll take this data and introduce an intervening variable. Maybe it's better healthcare, maybe it's a new therapy program, maybe it's better maternal oversight, or whatever intervening variable you're going to introduce. And this is what will help you track whether the problem is moving from 10,000 to something more favorable or something more desirable. This is a data approach. Now the problem is that when we are insisting on looking at the data and sticking to what the data is saying, most of us have what you call biases, and this is shown better in behavioral finance, where it shows that we are not thinking in the way that we ought to think. We either distort, we either generalize, or we either delete information that disagrees with the biases that we are holding. These biases are the ones that in turn affect the quality of decisions that we make. And the best example that we can see in this video is George W. Bush, and he comes to make a public address, and he points out that the axis of evil in the Middle East, and he points out that this axis of evil, or these enemies that he called terrorists, begin with Iraq, and the president then was Saddam Hussein. And he did mention in his campaign for war, this is post 9/11, that the country Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, and so there was the war on terror, and there was bombing and whatever campaign they did, and millions of people died. Now it is not until after the fact that it was discovered that there were no weapons of mass destruction. But how is it the president of such an advanced democracy can make a clear error in judgment? This error comes from the biases that he had and the existing recent event, which was 9/11, and there was a need to hold the narrative that we need to attack, and we need to be firm, and we need to do something that is very significant, that it shows we responded properly and equivalently when dealing with the 9/11 attack. But if we look at terrorism at large, there are several things that I believe are off. Now, the first thing is, when we are thinking about the odds or the numbers involved in that cause of death, that's one. Two, when we are looking at the type of soldier that we are fighting. Three, when we are looking at the dogmatic war inherent in terrorism. And this is what I mean by odds. When we look at the various causes of death by probability, the following comes out clearly. When we're talking about the probabilities of dying because of heart disease, 1 to 6, cancer, 1 to 7, COVID, 1 to 10, talking of an opioid overdose, stands at 1 to 58, Talking of suicide, has moved from 1 to 88 to 1 to 91. Choking on food, 1 to 2,659. Talking of dog attack, this is 1 into about 53,000. Now, all these are the various causes of death and the numbers that are inherent in those causes of death. But when we look at terrorism, the numbers stand at around 1 to 10 million. And if it's a foreigner coming to attack that country, it gets worse to about 1 into 30 million. Now, in my own opinion, if we look at these numbers, everything we are doing in Kenya, everything the Western countries are doing to fight terrorism is an overreaction. And I'm talking about the numbers that we are looking at here. The most significant problems are the ones that we need to address in terms of significance. In other words, I'm trying to say we have bigger problems than terrorism. It is not a very significant problem by number and given the population. Now, if we look at the 9/11, how many people died against the population of United States? That's 1. 2. When we went to Iraq, how many soldiers died against the numbers again of USA? You'll find that the problem became worse. We were trying to solve a problem that was so minuscule given the number of people that died, and we killed more people and we got no results, and we left with such an astounding humiliation, and it just boggles the mind at how wrong we got the equation. And the question that I can ask is this: if we look at the number of people that died on 9/11 and the soldiers that have died after, do we really think it's an overreaction? Now, the reason why we won't think it's an overreaction is this: these here are acts of God. They are more or less acts of God. Heart disease, cancer, COVID, and so forth, besides opioid overdose and suicide, all of them are acts of God, as it were. There is no premeditation on the part of a person. But when we're looking at this, it is a premeditated course of action. It is more or less like a thief coming and shooting a person. That is a premeditated action. But if we think collectively about what I mean by this being an overreaction, the amount of money we've used on the most important problems, the first two, heart disease and cancer, cannot compare to this. And this is what I mean. Collectively, globally, we've spent more than 2.1 trillion fighting terrorism. And I can assure you, we are not even close to that when looking at these two problems over here. So our overreaction is what the enemy wants, because in this sense, Kenya is an established country with a very powerful army, but Al-Shabaab is a small outfit, and their only goal is to spread fear, and that fear is what they feed on. So when we get an attack in Kenya, it is that fear that makes us to demand action, and it is that fear that makes us stifle the liberties of our own people. When we start coming up with oversights within our financial system that creates more problems than solutions, when we start deregulating or starting to have an immigration policy that is somewhat wrong compared to the past, all these things that we're doing to make ourselves feel better and safer is the very thing that a terrorist wants: spread fear and get that overreaction. But we say that the worst thing you can do is overreact to a small, minuscule problem. And this is it. That's the first thing. The odds of death are not adding up. So if then these are the numbers, does it mean we do nothing? No. The reason is that it's a premeditated thing. But going to war against Al-Shabaab in my own opinion, was not the proper way to go about it, because this is an eternal war, a war where there will be no winners, and a war that will keep on going generation after generation. And the reason I'm saying this is the last two things I've pointed here: the type of soldier. When we are going to war, the goal is to kill as many people, because death is a deterrent. The more I can kill and the less of mine that die, I can be able to procure a surrender from my enemy. That is the purpose of war. Any person that tells you we're going to war is because we want to kill these people and cause them to surrender. But the question is this: if America invaded North Korea, they're dealing with a conventional soldier, and death is a deterrent. If Russia goes to war with America, death is a deterrent because you're dealing with conventional soldiers who do not want to die. But when you're dealing with Islamic jihadists, death is a thing that they seek. If you've looked at the videos in their recruitment, and even videos of them playing games trying to pick who will be the suicide bomber, the looks on their faces when they are picked to be suicide bombers is one of sheer joy and sheer ecstasy. That's not a conventional soldier. That's not a soldier you can point your gun at and force a surrender from. And that's not the soldier you want to fight, because you cannot win. Even if you kill them, they will be the fuel for martyrdom, and there will be more recruitment as a result of them dying. So, in my own opinion, we are not dealing with a conventional soldier. And this non-conventional soldier, as much as they are defunded, as much as they do not have the resources, they have the sheer will derived from a doctrinal interpretation of Islam religion, and they are getting that resilience from a religious perspective. So you cannot win that at all. You cannot. Now, when we are looking at dogmatic wars, these are the hardest wars to beat. Any war that involves a theocratic ideology and not a political ideology cannot be won. If Russia and USA went to war, that's a political ideology war. If China goes to war with USA, that's a political ideology war. But when you're looking at any country that is fighting a theocratic war, there will never be victory in sight, and there will never be concessions at any given point. And the best example is the Israel-Palestine conflict. The Palestinians do not recognize the state of Israel, and Israel does not recognize the state of Palestine. Israel calls the Palestinians terrorists, and the Palestinians call Israelites occupiers. But beyond that, this whole conflict is not one of ideology, because within ideologies you can give concessions. It is a fact that Israel has given concessions time and again when it comes to conquered land. But the Palestinians have refused any concessions, because this is not a war on ideology, this is a theocratic war. Now the problem is it drags to it three major theocracies. The first one is Islam. The second one is Christianity, that draws most of its roots from the Judaic religion. There is nowhere you will find any victory if that is the case. There is nowhere you will find any concession if that is the case. So if we are to ask ourselves, what's the true front of this war? The front is one of doctrine. This is the true front where we need to fight any war that deals with terrorism, because it has to do with interpretation of scripture that involves a meaning of jihad that most Muslims do not agree to, or some agree to and choose to be silent about. Now, if we can get the proper people to interpret that scripture for majority of the followers of Islam, then we can have a situation where the recruitment pipeline gets stifled, because one, the recruitment pipeline is within the religious circles. There is a certain aspect of faith to it. There's a certain aspect of God to it. There's a certain aspect of promise for a better future in it that draws it from religion and not from war. So if we go to war, we might beat them down, but the dogma and the doctrine still remains. So for me, I say it is not a significant problem. We've got bigger issues in Kenya, and Al-Shabaab is not one of them. And it is a war of doctrine. And let me show you what I mean. It is a war of doctrine. Most of these jihadists are not fighting Christianity. It is a rare thing to find, unless you're speaking about Nigeria to be specific, and other isolated cases. There's no way there'll be a persecution of Christianity by the jihadists. It is a war on westernization. The true enemy of the jihadists is westernization. It is modernization that comes from the culture of westernization, as it were. There's that sexual liberal movement that comes from westernization. There's that fashion movement that comes from westernization. There's the female empowerment that comes from westernization, and there's even the political ideology of democracy that comes from westernization. In the view of a jihadist, the westernization process is the source of all corruption, and it is the enemy of the faith. And that is why Kenya is 80% Christian, as they say, yes, but the Al-Shabaab will always be picking spots where Westerners will use. Westgate is an example. You have Dusit as another example, and so forth and so forth. So the true enemy here is westernization and not Christianity as we think it is. So I hope this sheds light of my own perspective on how we got the problem wrong. And of course, people may differ in opinion. You can type your own opinion and get to have that conversation on what exactly it entails and what's the proper way to go about the problem. That's it for today. Have a lovely week ahead.